Now we're going to return you to our nation's capital, where we just got a big ruling in where the Supreme Court just released a decision on President Trump's tariff authority.
Yeah, this is breaking news. In their decision, they ruled against using Emergency Powers Act to impose tariffs, which undercuts the very foundation of the president's economic plans. You know, we have really followed this story since the very beginning, especially because there's a Vernon Hills company called Hand to Mind. They have learning resources for young children. We've spoken with the owners of that company repeatedly, as this has really bounced around in the court system for quite some time here. And you know, what they look at is the fact that these tariffs would essentially put them out of business, that the added cost to do business would put small businesses out of commission, essentially. You heard the governor talk about it in his State of the State address just this week, speaking about that very aspect.
Hey everyone, it's John. Today's topic makes people uneasy. The West Wing fell into a hollow silence as the Supreme Court, which Trump had remade in his image, seemed poised to hand him a devastating defeat in a case his inner circle had assured him was a slam dunk. The miscalculation left the administration scrambling to confront a reality it had never seriously contemplated. The case itself seemed technical on the surface. It was about tariffs, about the specific legal mechanism Trump had used to impose sweeping import duties on China, Europe, and other trading partners without going through Congress. But beneath that dry administrative question lurked something far more consequential: the entire architecture of Trump's governing strategy. For the better part of 2 years, Trump had governed through emergency declarations using a law passed in 1977 called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act.
Of the small businesses, I could tell you that just this week I also spoke with the founder of agnet.com.
Okay.
And he is a 7th generation farmer in central Illinois, and he talked about it. You know, obviously they look at it from a very different perspective, but if you think about the crops that they're harvesting, the imports, the exports, from that standpoint, you know, also talking about, I mean, he said this was one of the biggest issues that he has had to face in his time now running his family's company. And I asked him, like, okay, 7 generations, look at what those who came before you had to deal with. Was this the worst? And he was like, without a doubt, this has been one of the trickiest situations for them.
All right, we have our expert on the line, Ross Mack, economist, is going to join us now. Ross, first, let's start with, what is your reaction to this big-time decision by the U.S. Supreme Court?
To justify everything from trade wars to military deployments. He had claimed that national security emergencies gave him the authority to bypass normal legislative processes, to act unilaterally when Congress wouldn't give him what he wanted. And for a while, it had worked. The courts had mostly let him get away with it. The political system had accepted it as just the way things were done now. But then the Supreme Court signaled that those days might be over. The oral arguments were brutal, not in the sense of aggressive questioning from liberal justices, which Trump's team had expected and prepared for. What they hadn't expected was the conservative justices, the ones Trump had personally appointed, the ones he had counted on to provide reliable votes for his agenda, asking questions that cut directly through the administration's legal theories like a surgeon's scalpel. Chief Justice Roberts pressed Trump's lawyers on whether there were any limits at all on presidential emergency powers.
Well, I was trying to actually see exactly what happened. I was watching CNBC, and I know they were saying, you know, it's a 170-page document, and therefore they actually got to go through it kind of line by line. But right now I'm actually trying to see, I think, you know, when it's all said and done, it's like it can potentially have adverse impact on the market. But I think, you know, if the Supreme Court is to uphold it, I think that, you know, it's a function of how difficult is it to contain inflation, right? I think this is a function of who actually takes on these price hikes. Is it the foreign producers or is it the end consumer here? And I think, you know, so far we've been seeing inflation be extremely persistent. And as a result, the American consumer actually has been really bold, you know, holding that cost. And, you know, as we all understand, the cost of living has been extremely high as of recent.
Yeah, it's so hard because businesses can only boost their prices to offset that so much. when you have people who are already feeling cash strapped. Ross, over the last few days, even yesterday, the stock market.
Could the president declare any situation an emergency and take any action? The question hung in the air, devastating in its simplicity, because it exposed the logical endpoint of Trump's argument. If emergencies could be declared for anything, and if those declarations gave the president unlimited authority, then the entire structure of constitutional government became meaningless. Justice Kavanaugh, another Trump appointee, asked about Congress's role. Had the legislative branch been effectively cut out of trade policy decisions? The question suggested that Kavanaugh, despite his conservative credentials and his appointment by Trump, was genuinely concerned about separation of powers and whether the president had gone too far in bypassing Congress. And then came Justice Sotomayor's question, the one that legal analysts would replay for days afterward. She pointed to a recent case involving the Biden administration and asked whether the court had not already stated that an emergency cannot clarify what is ambiguous.
Was read all day. The last few days ahead of that, we saw some volatility there. But look, right now on your screen, we're showing, there was some green popped up here. How do you think the day is going to play out?
Well, I think it's important that we understand everything is relative. If you look at the stock market, it's still extremely it's been doing extremely well, right? I think, and this really bodes to the fact that we're in a K-shaped economy, right? Where the people that own assets are doing well, where the people that don't are actually feeling the true impact of higher inflation, right? As you showed Dow Jones just crept over 50,000, which was monumental. And as you can see, it's not far off. And so I think that the stock market has obviously been extremely resilient, right? I think the first time we talked about these tariffs and Liberation Day was a year ago, and that's when we first saw the pain. And since then, the market has truly just shrugged it off. And so I think to anybody that's an investor.
That question went straight to the heart of Trump's legal strategy. His entire argument depended on the idea that the 1977 law was vague enough to give him broad discretion, and that the emergency he had declared clarified that vagueness in his favor. Sotomayor was essentially saying, we already decided that doesn't work. You can't use emergencies to do things the law doesn't clearly authorize. The room went cold for Trump's legal team. They had walked into the Supreme Court expecting to defend a legal interpretation they had been using successfully for years. They left realizing they might have just been the defendants in one of the most significant constitutional cases in decades, and they were losing. Within hours, the reaction inside the White House was described by multiple sources as sheer panic.
Don't, look at a day like today in a microcosm and say, oh, now let me be risk off. I think, everybody should always remain long term, because the market already has digested and said we are able to live with tariffs. Now, in the event the Supreme Court is to reverse it, that could very well be good in the short term for the stock market. But nonetheless, we got to look at this on a long-term standpoint, and then you could actually say which sectors are going to do well. And I think that's the one thing that might change. But I think in terms of dollars that's been on the sideline, the stock market, once again, all of the indices are near all-time highs, right? And now if we're saying which sectors may do better than the others, now we're talking about companies who assemble their products, whether it's in China or India, et cetera, whether it's autos, whether it's, devices, electronic devices, phones, computers, et cetera, that might, we might actually see some of those prices come down for the end consumer. But when it's all said and done, I always implore people, be a long-term investor and don't even look at it.
Ross, I want to make sure here that we have been led to believe that the Supreme Court has indeed reversed the decision on tariffs. Are you hearing something different from that?
Not the controlled anxiety of a political operation facing a difficult vote, but the raw, visceral fear of an administration that suddenly realizes its entire governing strategy might be declared unconstitutional. Emergency meetings were called throughout the West Wing. Senior advisors huddled in the Situation Room, trying to game out scenarios that had previously seemed impossible. What happened if the court struck down just the tariffs? What if they issued a broader ruling that affected everything Trump had done under emergency authority? Cabinet members were reportedly discussing whether they should resign before the decision came down, whether they wanted to be associated with policies that the Supreme Court might soon label illegal. Legal teams were scrambling to prepare for a wave of litigation that could challenge every major policy decision Trump had made over the past 2 years. This was not normal. Supreme Court cases don't usually trigger this kind of crisis atmosphere. The administration had weathered tough oral arguments before and come out fine. But this was different because the stakes were so incredibly high and because the conservative justices, the ones Trump had relied on, were not coming to his rescue. If the court ruled broadly against Trump's use of emergency powers, it wouldn't just affect tariffs. It could potentially invalidate dozens of major policy decisions. Military deployments Trump had authorized under emergency declarations, sanctions he had imposed on foreign nations, executive orders based on emergency authority, all of it could suddenly become vulnerable to legal challenge. And even if those challenges didn't all succeed, defending against them would consume enormous time and resources. It would force Trump to constantly justify actions the courts had already questioned. It would turn governing from a proactive activity into a reactive defense of every decision. The political implications were equally devastating. Trump had built his brand around being a strong executive, someone who got things done without being bogged down by Congress. He had presented himself as the decisive leader who took action while the legislative branch dithered and debated. But if the Supreme Court said he'd been overstepping his authority all along, that narrative would collapse. He would look weak instead of strong. He would look like someone who tried to violate the Constitution instead of someone who was effectively governing. And heading into critical midterm elections, that was a political disaster waiting to happen. Democrats would use the ruling to attack Trump as a would-be authoritarian who had to be reined in by the courts. Republicans would be in the awkward position of either defending Trump's overreach or admitting the Supreme Court was right to limit his power. Neither option was politically attractive. What made the situation even more devastating for Trump was that the conservative justices were the ones asking the toughest questions. This wasn't a partisan split where liberal justices opposed Trump and conservatives supported him. This was the court coming together across ideological lines to put limits on presidential power, regardless of who was in office. That meant Trump couldn't rely on his appointees to save him. He had to actually win on the legal merits. And based on how the oral arguments had gone, that wasn't going to happen. Legal experts following the case were calling it a defining test for presidential power. They were saying it could be one of the most significant Supreme Court decisions in decades because it would determine how much authority presidents have to act unilaterally during claimed emergencies. The implications went way beyond Trump. Whatever precedent got set in this case would affect every future president, Democrat and Republican. If the court ruled that emergency powers were more limited than Trump claimed, future presidents wouldn't be able to use the same tactics Trump had used. That might be good for constitutional balance and separation of powers, but it was terrible news for Trump right now because he'd built his entire presidency around maximizing executive authority and bypassing Congress whenever possible. The tension inside the administration was reportedly at an all-time high. Cabinet members were worried about being associated with policies that might get struck down as unconstitutional. Lawyers were worried about their professional reputations if they'd been advising Trump to take actions the Supreme Court said were illegal. And Trump himself was apparently furious that his own court appointees weren't backing him up the way he expected. This was shaping up to be one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions of Trump's presidency, and it was coming at the worst possible time as he was trying to govern and prepare for elections. But to understand why this case matters so much, you have to go beyond the surface-level question of whether Trump can impose tariffs. This is fundamentally about the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. It's about whether presidents can use emergency declarations to do things Congress won't authorize. And it's about whether the Supreme Court is willing to put meaningful limits on presidential power, or whether they'll continue letting the executive branch expand its authority unchecked. The specific legal issue at stake revolves around the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. That law gives the president authority to regulate international commerce during national emergencies. But the law is intentionally vague about what constitutes an emergency and what actions the president can take. Trump has interpreted that vagueness as giving him almost unlimited authority. He's declared economic emergencies related to trade imbalances, national security concerns, and various other justifications. And he's used those emergency declarations to impose tariffs that Congress probably wouldn't approve if they had to vote on them. The plaintiffs challenging Trump's tariffs argue that he's abusing the emergency powers law. They say Congress never intended to give presidents the authority to unilaterally reshape American trade policy without any legislative input. They point out that the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. And they argue that letting Trump use emergency declarations to bypass Congress violates the separation of powers. Trump's lawyers counter that the law gives the president broad discretion to determine what constitutes an emergency and what actions are necessary to address it. They say courts shouldn't second-guess presidential decisions about national security and economic policy. And they argue that limiting Trump's authority would hamstring future presidents trying to respond to real emergencies. Both sides make compelling arguments, but based on the oral arguments, it seems like the justices are leaning toward the plaintiff's interpretation. The specific questions the justices asked during oral arguments are really revealing. Justice Sotomayor's question about whether emergencies can clarify ambiguity suggests she thinks Trump is stretching the law beyond what it was meant to allow. Chief Justice Roberts reportedly asked Trump's lawyers whether there are any limits on presidential emergency powers, whether the president could declare any situation an emergency and take any action. That's the kind of question that suggests Roberts is worried about creating a precedent that gives presidents too much unchecked power. Justice Kavanaugh asked about Congress's role and whether the legislative branch has been effectively cut out of trade policy decisions. Again, that suggests concern about separation of powers and whether Trump has gone too far in bypassing Congress. These aren't softballs. These are tough questions that get to the fundamental constitutional issues at stake. What makes this particularly interesting is that the conservative justices seem just as concerned as the liberal justices. Normally, you'd expect a partisan split on a case involving Trump's authority. Conservative justices backing Trump, liberal justices opposing him. But that's not what happened during oral arguments. The conservative justices were asking hard questions too. They were pushing back on Trump's lawyers' arguments. They were expressing skepticism about unlimited presidential power. That suggests this might be a case where the court's decision isn't driven by politics, but by genuine constitutional concerns. And if that's true, Trump is in trouble because the legal arguments against his position are pretty strong. The law wasn't designed to give presidents the kind of sweeping authority Trump has been claiming. And the court knows that letting Trump get away with this interpretation sets a dangerous precedent for future presidents. The potential scope of the ruling is what has the White House in panic mode. If the court rules narrowly, they might just strike down Trump's specific tariffs without affecting his other uses of emergency powers. That would be bad, but manageable. Trump could try different legal justifications for the tariffs or work with Congress to get legislative approval. But if the court rules broadly, if they say that emergency powers can't be used the way Trump has been using them, then it affects everything. Military deployments that Trump authorized under emergency declarations could be challenged. Sanctions he imposed could be questioned. Executive orders based on emergency authority could be invalidated. Suddenly, Trump's entire governing strategy falls apart because he's been relying heavily on emergency powers to bypass Congress and implement policies unilaterally. A broad Supreme Court ruling could force Trump to actually work with Congress on major policy decisions. And given how divided Congress is, that means many of Trump's priorities simply won't happen. The internal White House reaction reflects how serious this is. Reports describe emergency meetings throughout the administration as officials try to game out different scenarios. What happens if the court strikes down just the tariffs? What if they issue a broader ruling? How do they prepare for either possibility? There are reportedly discussions about whether to start working with Congress proactively on legislation to authorize tariffs before the court rules. But that opens up its own problems because Congress might not give Trump everything he wants. Some cabinet members are apparently so worried about the ruling that they're considering resigning before it comes down. They don't want to be associated with policies that get declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. That's how toxic this situation has become. Even loyal Trump appointees are thinking about jumping ship. The political implications are enormous. Trump has built his political brand around being a strong executive who gets things done without being bogged down by Congress. He's presented himself as someone who takes decisive action while Congress debates endlessly. But if the Supreme Court says Trump has been overstepping his authority all along, that narrative collapses. Trump looks weak instead of strong. He looks like someone who tried to violate the Constitution instead of someone who was effectively governing. And heading into midterm elections, that's a political disaster. Democrats will use the ruling to attack Trump as a would-be authoritarian who had to be reined in by the courts. Republicans will be in the awkward position of either defending Trump's overreach or admitting the Supreme Court was right to limit his power. Neither option is good politically. Let's also talk about the international implications, because tariffs aren't just a domestic issue. Trump's tariffs have disrupted trade relationships with allies and adversaries. Other countries have retaliated with their own tariffs. Supply chains have been disrupted. Businesses have had to adjust to unpredictable trade policies. If the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's tariffs, what happens to all those trade relationships? Do the tariffs immediately disappear? Does Trump have to negotiate new arrangements with other countries? Do businesses that adjusted to the tariffs suddenly have to readjust? The economic chaos could be significant. And that economic chaos has political consequences because voters care about economic stability. If Trump's tariff policy gets struck down and creates market uncertainty and business disruption, voters are going to blame Trump for the mess. The conservative legal movement is in a really awkward position here too. For years, conservatives have argued for limiting executive power and restoring congressional authority. They've criticized Democratic presidents for overusing executive actions. They've championed separation of powers and constitutional limits. But now their guy Trump is the one claiming sweeping executive authority and bypassing Congress. Do conservatives stick with their principles and support limiting Trump's power, or do they abandon those principles to back Trump? Different conservative legal scholars are going different directions on this. Some are arguing that the court should limit Trump's emergency powers because that's consistent with conservative constitutional principles. Others are arguing that Trump needs broad authority to effectively govern, and the court shouldn't interfere. The internal division within the conservative legal movement reflects how complicated this case is politically and legally. The bottom line is that this case has real-world consequences that are going to affect millions of people. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments, and based on normal timelines, a decision was expected sometime in the coming months. The justices would deliberate, draft opinions, circulate them among themselves, and eventually release a ruling. What that ruling says is the trillion-dollar question. If they rule narrowly, they might just strike down Trump's specific tariffs on technical grounds without addressing the broader constitutional issues. That would be a limited loss for Trump, embarrassing but not catastrophic. But if they rule broadly and say that presidents can't use emergency powers the way Trump has been using them, that's a game changer that affects everything Trump does. What happens to existing tariffs if the court rules against Trump is complicated. If the court says Trump's tariffs are illegal, they probably don't just automatically disappear. There would need to be some kind of unwinding process. Trump might have 60 or 90 days to either get congressional approval for the tariffs or phase them out. That creates a period of economic uncertainty, as businesses don't know what trade policy will look like going forward, and it puts enormous pressure on Congress to act. Do they authorize Trump's tariffs retroactively to avoid economic disruption, or do they let them expire and deal with the economic fallout? Neither option is politically easy, which is why everyone in Washington is dreading this decision. How this affects Trump's other uses of emergency powers is where things get really complicated. Trump has declared multiple national emergencies during his presidency. He's used emergency powers to redirect military funding, impose sanctions, deploy troops, and implement various other policies. If the Supreme Court issues a broad ruling saying emergency powers are more limited than Trump claims, all of those actions become potentially vulnerable to legal challenge. We could see a wave of lawsuits challenging everything Trump has done under emergency authority. And even if those lawsuits don't all succeed, defending against them takes time and resources and creates political problems. Trump would have to constantly justify his actions and defend his use of emergency powers instead of focusing on implementing his agenda. The political timing couldn't be worse for Trump. Midterm elections are less than a year away. Republicans need to run on a record of accomplishments and effective governance. But if the Supreme Court strikes down major parts of Trump's economic policy, that becomes really difficult. Democrats will argue that Trump has been governing unconstitutionally and needed to be reined in by the courts. They'll point to the Supreme Court decision as proof that Trump can't be trusted with power. Republicans will try to spin it as judicial overreach or argue that Trump was trying to protect American workers. But defending a Supreme Court loss is never easy politically, and this could depress Republican turnout or energize Democratic voters who see it as vindication that Trump has been overstepping his authority. The constitutional principles at stake extend far beyond this specific case. The Constitution establishes separation of powers. Congress makes laws, the president executes them, and courts interpret them. That system only works if each branch stays in its lane and respects the other's authority. For decades, the balance has been shifting toward more executive power and less congressional authority. Presidents of both parties have been expanding their ability to act unilaterally through executive orders, emergency declarations, and creative interpretations of existing laws. Congress has largely allowed this to happen because it's easier to let the president take politically risky actions than to vote on them. But the result is that presidents now have far more power than the founders probably intended. This Supreme Court case is potentially a correction. The court saying, we've let executive power expand too far and it's time to restore some balance. Whether you think that's good depends partly on your political preferences and partly on your constitutional philosophy. If you like Trump's policies, you probably want the court to give him maximum flexibility to implement them. If you don't like Trump's policies, you probably want the court to limit his power. But the smarter way to think about it is, what kind of precedent do you want set for all future presidents? Because whatever the court decides in this case will apply to the next president and the one after that. If you give Trump unlimited emergency powers, you're also giving those powers to every future president. And you might not like how the next president uses them. That's why some conservatives are actually supporting limits on Trump's authority in this case. They're thinking long-term about constitutional structure rather than short-term political wins. The panic inside the White House reflects that they understand how high the stakes are. This isn't just another court case they can spin or ignore. This is the Supreme Court potentially invalidating core elements of Trump's governing strategy. Senior advisors are scrambling to prepare contingency plans. What policies can they salvage if the tariffs get struck down? How do they work with Congress to get legislative authorization for things they've been doing unilaterally? How do they minimize the political damage from a Supreme Court loss? These are the conversations happening right now in the West Wing, and they're not easy conversations because there aren't good answers. You can't undo 2 years of governing based on emergency powers overnight. The disruption would be massive. Here's what to watch for over the coming months. First, whether the administration starts working with Congress proactively to authorize tariffs or other policies before the court rules. That would signal they expect to lose and are trying to get ahead of it. Second, whether any cabinet members or senior advisors resign. If people start jumping ship, it suggests they think the situation is unwinnable and they want to distance themselves before the court rules. Third, how businesses and financial markets react to the uncertainty. If markets start pricing in the possibility that tariffs will be struck down, that creates economic pressure on Trump to settle or compromise. Fourth, what the court actually says when they issue their decision. The specific language they use will determine how broad the ruling is and what it means for future cases. The long-term implications of this case can't be overstated. This could be one of those landmark Supreme Court decisions that gets taught in constitutional law classes for generations. It could fundamentally reshape the balance of power between Congress and the president. It could force a rethinking of how emergency powers work and what limits exist on presidential authority. And it's all happening because Trump pushed the boundaries of executive power further than any recent president. He tested the system, and now the system is pushing back. Whether you think that's good or bad probably depends on your politics. But everyone should care about getting the constitutional structure right, because that affects all of us regardless of party. The Supreme Court seems skeptical of Trump's use of emergency powers for tariffs, and a broad ruling against him could invalidate key parts of his economic agenda. The uncertainty alone is already creating political and economic problems, and the stakes, a potential landmark constitutional decision, could be enormous.